Well, welcome back to the podcast. I took a break for a couple of weeks during Christmas break. A lot has happened during that time, and so I'm going to try to cover a few things today from a biblical perspective. Make sure you subscribe to the show to get notified when new episodes come out every single week. I'd love to hear your comments as well. Let's get to it. Well, since the last episode, Zohran Mamdani has been installed as the mayor of New York City, and his inauguration speech was just wild. He basically clearly said that he intends to rule New York City in a way that I think is counter to the Constitution and to American principles. And so there are two ideologies that I really don't think square or can work at all with the U.S. Constitution, and he represents both of them, and that is Islam and communism. And so the big quote that everyone is talking about from the speech is where he said, "We will replace the frigidity of rugged individualism with the warmth of collectivism." So here we go again with this utopian view of collectivism and socialism, and how beautiful to describe it as warm and accepting and comfortable, while describing individualism as frigid and cold and harsh, right? And so you've seen the memes of pictures of Korea at night, right? Where you can see that there's almost no electricity in the north part of Korea, in northern Korea. And then in South Korea, you can see it's lit up at night because they have electricity and things are going well for them. And people have made the comment on that meme: is this the warmth of collectivism that he's talking about? Pictures like that kind of sum up the whole thing, right? Everyone always says that it's just never been tried correctly, or it's just because bad people were running it. But they're missing a couple of biblical principles that guarantee that it is never going to work. One biblical principle is that we are by nature sinners. I'll get back to that in just a second. The other principle is that that's really important is this idea of personal responsibility. Scripture is clear that we should feel personally responsible for our own welfare, not leave it up to the state, right? And Paul says if you don't work, you don't eat. Paul says that a man that doesn't provide for his family is worse than an unbeliever. Proverbs talks about planning ahead. A society that's not based on this pressure for every husband especially, but every family to make its own way. If a culture's not based on that pressure, it's going to collapse. And a society that punishes those who plan ahead and work hard is just going to de-incentivize hard work and innovation. But we also talked about this principle of sin nature, right? Like that's the first one that I mentioned. And what we find is the only way for a government to force everyone to share everything is for someone to be in charge and manage it. And that's where things get scary. If you're talking about 20 people living on a farm together, then maybe they can all kind of have their roles. And if there's a big decision to be made, they can all come together and decide that every single time, vote on that every single time with 20 people. But when you're talking about an entire country, someone has to have all of that power, collective power, all of the means of production, all of the assets. It all has to be concentrated into one person or a few people's hands. And there's a reason that the saying says absolute power corrupts absolutely. That is too much power in a government's hands, right? And so this is why in every case, individual freedoms get taken away and totalitarian leaders abuse people who won't go along with the plan. It's interesting that you never see a collectivist society that still allows free speech. Isn't that interesting? And even right now, what you're seeing in the UK and other Western nations, including a growing trend of people's opinions in the United States, where free speech is being limited. You see a lot of people in the United States nowadays kind of talking like, hey, maybe we shouldn't allow speech about this, or maybe we should stop people from talking about that. And so literally they don't understand that when you take away somebody else's ability to speak freely, eventually it's everybody's ability or freedom to speak as well. And so you saw this with our last administration. They initially tried to create a misinformation department to limit information they didn't agree with. Stuff that they called misinformation turned out 6 months later to all be true. Any system that depends on shutting down free conversation in order to sneak it in is a very bad system. So I'm not sure how much of this agenda Mamdani will really get away with. I think that a lot of what he's attempting to do is just going to end up in court, and I think we're already seeing some of that. Businesses and people who are wealthy are already looking to relocate out of there, which will just make New York City poorer as he's planning to give away more and more things. So I don't think that's going to work very well. And so we're going to see, hopefully this experiment in New York City will be the end. Maybe we'll see just how bad it can be. Just kind of like how things went during the Biden administration, where they just unleashed the whole leftist agenda, and everybody said, "Wow, this is really bad for the country." So we'll see how this goes. All right, well, let's get on to what is going on in Minnesota with all the fraud there. First of all, this is a classic case of why you can't trust the government to spend your money better than you can. Bureaucracies whose goal is to shout out all the money that they have been given, to give away. Or if they don't spend it all by the end of the year, they won't get as much next year. They're famous for not double checking anything or holding people accountable for what they're doing with the money. And that's exactly what you've got going on there. Recently, Nick Shirley became very famous for going around and revealing that these Somali run daycares that are receiving a ton of government funding are empty. They don't actually operate as daycares at all, but they take the money. Now, connect this with the last story we just talked about in New York City, where Mamdani is promising free childcare. Do we really expect better results from the New York City government? Just think about that for a second. Another huge fraud issue in Minnesota is the Feeding Our Future case that started during the pandemic. These schemes targeted child nutrition programs, autism services, housing assistance, and other Medicaid-funded initiatives. A nonprofit founded by Amy Bach, who is not Somali, by the way, sponsored meal sites claiming to feed needy children. Prosecutors allege that defendants submitted fake invoices, attendance rosters, and meal counts, stealing over $250 million. Federal charges began in 2022, and as of early 2026, 70 to 78 defendants were charged in this case alone, with over 50 convictions or guilty pleas. Bach and her co-defendant, Salim Saeed, who is Somali American, were convicted in 2025 of wire fraud and bribery. Investigations expanded to autism therapy, housing stabilization, and other programs, with total alleged losses potentially exceeding $1 billion, and prosecutors have suggested that it could be up to $9 billion across 14 high-risk programs since 2018. And of course, that still remains under audit and is disputed right now. As of January 2026, federal charges reached 92 to 98 people across these related cases, with 62 to 64 convictions. Fraudsters allegedly used funds for luxury goods, real estate, vehicles, travel, and other services. And instead of doing what they said they were going to do with the money. So the vast majority, 82 to 85 out of the 92 to 98 defendants, are of Somali descent, or they are Somali American. Many operated sites or companies serving or owned by members of Minnesota's large Somali diaspora, which is the largest in the U.S. Critics, including federal prosecutors and Republicans, argue that state oversight under Governor Tim Walz was lax, partly due to fears of racism accusations when scrutinizing Somali-linked providers. So they were not willing to hold anybody accountable because they didn't want to be called racist. A state auditor report found threats of discrimination lawsuits delayed action that should have been taken. Of course, there is also the issue of how much knowledge various state leaders had, and were they complicit in all of this waste. There is a resurfaced audio recording from a private December 2021 meeting in Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison's office, involving Ellison and several Somali American community members and business leaders, and many of those attendees were later charged or convicted in the Feeding Our Future fraud scheme. Ellison expresses sympathy for the group's concern about state agency scrutiny of their programs. So in other words, he's saying, look, I'm sorry that state agencies are looking into what you're doing. And he states that he is in the middle of the battle with the agencies now. So he's trying to stop them from scrutinizing what they're doing. He directly references Governor Tim Walz, saying, Walz agrees with me that this piddly stupid stuff running small people out of business is terrible. At the time, which is late 2021, the State Department of Education was investigating potential irregularities in meal sites sponsored by Feeding Our Future, and the nonprofit had sued to block oversight. So they're suing to say you can't oversee us. Ellison appears to be advocating against aggressive enforcement actions that could shut down small providers, framing it as overly harsh on minority-owned businesses. So it's all about, hey, we can't mess with this because it's minority. Participants discussed pooling funds for political support and later donated to Ellison's campaign, although for those who were convicted, he returned those donations. So just to understand that. Of course, the Somali community in Minnesota has come under further scrutiny, as it has been shown that a huge percentage compared to the general population is on SNAP benefits and Medicaid. There have been calls from some conservatives to denaturalize those who have become citizens if they were involved in fraud and to deport them. And I'm not sure how I feel about that. I'm not sure if that's a great precedent. It would seem that if we did a poor job of vetting these folks and we let them become citizens, then maybe they should just be tried for fraud and locked up versus taking away their citizenship and deporting them. However, I will say this, from 1990 to 2017, the process of denaturalizing citizens has been used about 11 times per year. And it's mostly with people with terrorism ties. After the Supreme Court ruling in the 60s, denaturalizing people who have become citizens has been used very, very sparingly. So I think, I'm not sure how feasible that concept is. The concerning thing about the Somali community is that by and large, obviously not all of them, they have come here to take and not contribute. And that's a problem. And this is something we cannot allow in our immigration process. I've said this before, but when we talk about the idea that we're a nation of immigrants, we're talking about a time when we required that if you were coming here, that you had a plan for how you were going to support yourself and support your family, and we didn't have all the welfare that we have now. There is this quote by Milton Friedman that I have seen cut short by people who advocate complete unchecked immigration, and I want you to listen to this. Take a moment to listen to this.
The United States, as you know, before 1914 had completely free immigration. Anybody could get on a boat and come to these shores, and if he landed on Ellis Island, he was an immigrant. Was that a good thing or a bad thing? You will find hardly a soul who will say it was a bad thing. Almost everybody will say it was a good thing. But then I suppose I say to the same people, but now what about today? Do you think we should have free immigration? Oh, no, they'll say, we couldn't possibly have free immigration today. Why, that would flood us with immigrants from India and God knows where. We'd be driven down to a bare subsistence level. What's the difference? How can people be so inconsistent? Why is it that free immigration was a good thing before 1914 and free immigration is a bad thing today? Well, there's a sense in which that answer is right. There's a sense in which free immigration, in the same sense as we had it before 1914, is not possible today. Why not? Because it is one thing to have free immigration to jobs. It is another thing to have free immigration to welfare. And you cannot have both. If you have a welfare state, if you have a state in which every resident is promised certain minimum level of income or a minimum level of subsistence, regardless of whether he works or not, produces it or not, well, then it really is an impossible thing.
Now, some people have cut that quote before he explains the difference between then and now, and that the difference is that then you couldn't come here for a ton of handouts, and that now you can, and our country can't sustain that. And so they cut it short before that, and then they just basically are making the point of, why are people so upset? They're happy with it back in this era, but they're not happy with it now. And then they just cut it. But then he explains the difference, that you can't, as a country, just have handouts to people who come here and just let people come unchecked. It's just not possible. Obviously, we can't and we shouldn't paint a whole group of people a certain way, but we absolutely should vet people, and we absolutely should hold people accountable and expect them to make their own way. Now, one last thing I want to get to, well, it's not the last thing. I got one bonus thing today, but the big last story that I want to get to today is the arrest of Maduro. On January 3rd, 2026, U.S. forces captured Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro in a military operation in Caracas, leading to his extradition to the United States on a long-standing drug trafficking and narco-terrorism charges, which that indictment happened under President Biden, by the way. To be honest, I don't know exactly what I think about this. I'm not concerned that Trump didn't check with Congress. That ship has sailed. For decades, presidents have been running operations like this without congressional approval. It's hypocritical honestly for anybody to say, oh, that's the problem here. The gray area is that the Constitution does not require a declaration of war for every military operation. But Congress is capable of declaring war. So it's kind of unclear exactly at what point, how much conflict do we have to get in before the president should ask Congress for a declaration of war. So all the pearl clutching about that is just dumb, to be honest with you. I think the concern is whether we have authority or should take authority to go and remove another country's leader. Now, we, of course, would be furious if that happened to us. However, this guy has been a very bad guy for a long time. He has not really been recognized as the legitimate leader of Venezuela, so that's important to understand. So it's kind of not like we went in and took somebody else's head of state, right? Even the Biden administration did not recognize the sham of an election in 2018 and again in 2024. The Biden administration also increased the reward for his capture by $10 million, increased it $10 million. So the Biden administration was actively wanting him removed as well. Just the Trump administration actually did something about it. So this is a very unusual case in that he was a narco-terrorist who was not duly elected, and both parties agreed that he should be removed. He was also not cooperating with the Trump administration's demand to stop the drug trafficking. Some say that we're stealing oil, and that's what this is all about. However, if you understand the history there, U.S. companies invested a ton into their oil industry there, and those assets have been seized by the Venezuelan government. And so we really are just making that right. But that's how socialism works, right? The people who put all the work in and take all the financial risks have their assets taken away and then squandered because the country is worse off than it's ever been. Overall, this operation is similar to when George H.W. Bush had Manuel Noriega, the Panamanian dictator, captured. So it's very similar in that way. So this is not without precedent. Both parties have declared that he was not the legitimate leader of the country and that he was a narco-terrorist. But now some people are indignant that he's been captured. And I will just say this, as far as U.S. security goes, the Trump policy has begun to become, they now call it the Donroe Doctrine instead of the Monroe Doctrine. But just basically, we're going to keep our hemisphere safe from our enemies. And China and Russia, their influence was growing mightily in Venezuela and was getting out of hand. Overall, I think it was a good move. I think we have to be really careful about these types of things. This should be really rare. And of course, removing dictators when a country is corrupt really never goes great because the people who tend to step in are usually no better. One other thing I want to cover, and I want to cover this because people think that Christians don't hold Donald Trump accountable ever, and so I just want to point out some things. A lot of what Donald Trump says you can kind of chalk up to just bluster, or he's using intimidation as negotiation, or those kinds of things. He's frank, he just says what's on his mind, which I actually think a lot of people appreciate instead of all the political speak. But there are a couple things he said recently that are just terrible, honestly. And first of all, he called Tim Walz retarded. And I think that's just really unprofessional. It's offensive to people with certain disabilities. And to be honest, Tim Walz is actually incompetent. He really is. And this fraud scheme is actually showing that, if not corrupt. He's either incompetent or corrupt, or maybe both. And as a political opponent, I guess Trump should be able to say that, but that's not the way to say it. And so I just think that's just completely unprofessional. It's mean, and I think that's the thing. That's why people have Trump derangement syndrome, so to speak, is because they just are so turned off by how mean he can be, and that's a classic case of it. Speaking of Trump derangement syndrome, he made a pretty bad post about the Reiner murders, talking about how they had Trump derangement syndrome. And, Reiner may have been a classic case, by the way, of Trump derangement syndrome. But, man, that's a terrible time to talk about stuff like that, literally right after they were murdered. And so Trump has made several comments about, his chances of getting into heaven, his own chances of getting into heaven. His answers always seem to revolve around the idea that he hopes he'll do enough or be good enough to get to heaven. I don't think he's a Christian. And so because of that, while his overall agenda is something that Christians can support for the most part, there are times that he just does these things that are pretty mean and unprofessional and unchristian. And that's why I didn't vote for him in the last primary. I'll be honest with you. I want most of his policies, but without the personality that has dominated the mainstream media and created all the Trump derangement syndrome in people. I know that whatever conservative is put up, the media will tear them apart as well and talk about what terrible, mean people they are. But truly, he has done so much to keep that stereotype of himself going, and that's his fault. And so that's why, honestly, I was hoping we could go a different direction and disconnect conservative views from his personality this time around. And so obviously I was glad to have him instead of Harris. But as Christians, sometimes we act like that we should always be able to vote for a thoroughly Christian option. And frankly, we've been fooled many times. Many people have tried to convince us, I'm the thoroughly Christian option, and we all go vote for him, and they're not really. And I think people, talk about Christian nationalism and talk about how Christians are such hypocritical. Honestly, I don't think Christians ever thought that Donald Trump was some sort of saint. In most countries, though, there's not an option. There's never an option. And it's a lot of these very secular nations, there's never an option that's a really Christian option. And so you just always have to vote for what's best for the country, or at least what is not the worst for the country. And so as Christians, we do need to be willing to call these things out, though, when we see them. And so, just not acceptable, not professional. And again, I think if we can keep these conservative ideas and detach them from his personality, it would actually be a good thing in the future. That is all that we have for this week. We covered a lot of ground today. Thanks for hanging in there, and we will see you next week.